Chapter 9. Conscious Machines. If I have succeeded in doing one thing in this book, I hope it is to have convinced you that while the recent breakthroughs in AI and machine learning are real and exciting, they are not a silver bullet for general AI. Deep learning may be an important ingredient for general AI, but it is by no means the only ingredient. Indeed, we don't yet know what some of the other ingredients are, still less what the recipe for general AI might look like. All the impressive capabilities we have developed, image recognition, language translation, driverless cars, don't add up to general intelligence. In this sense, we are still facing the problem that Rodney Brooks highlighted back in the 1980s. We have some components of intelligence, but no idea how to build a system that integrates them. And in any case, some of the key components are still missing. As we have seen, even the best of contemporary AI systems cannot exhibit any meaningful understanding of what they are doing. For all that they may excel at what they do, they are nothing more than software components optimized to carry out a specific, narrow task. Since I believe we are a long way from general AI, it naturally follows that I should be even more dubious about the prospects for strong AI, the idea of machines that are, like us, conscious, self-aware, truly autonomous beings. Nevertheless, in this final chapter, let's indulge ourselves. Even though strong AI is not anywhere in prospect, we can still have some fun thinking about it and speculating about how we might progress toward it. So, let's take a trip together down the road to conscious machines. We'll imagine what the landscape might look like, which obstacles we might meet, and what sights we can expect to see on the way. And crucially, we'll talk about how we can know when we're near the end of the road. Consciousness, mind, and other mysteries. In 1838, the British scientist John Herschel carried out a simple experiment in an attempt to find out how much energy was being radiated by our sun. He exposed a container of water to sunlight and measured how long it took for the sun's energy to raise the temperature of the water in the container by 1 degree Celsius. A simple calculation then allowed Herschel to estimate how much energy our star emits every second. The results were beyond comprehension. In 1 second, the sun radiates unimaginable quantities of energy, an inordinately larger amount than is generated on Earth in a whole year. But this created a scientific conundrum. Emerging geological evidence indicated that our world, and hence our sun, was tens of millions of years old, at least. But there was no known physical process that could power the sun for such huge periods of time. Any known source of energy would result in the sun burning out in, at most, a few thousand years. Scientists of the time flailed around, inventing charmingly implausible theories in an attempt to reconcile the evidence of a simple, easily repeatable experiment with the evidence of the geological record. In the event, it was not until the end of the 19th century and the emergence of nuclear physics that scientists began to understand the ferocious powers latent within the atomic nucleus. It was a whole century after Herschel's experiment before physicist Hans Bethe was finally able to present what is now the widely accepted account of energy production in stars by means of nuclear fusion. When we turn to strong AI, the goal of building machines that really have conscious minds, self-awareness, and understanding, in much the same way as we do, we find ourselves in the same position as scientists of Herschel's time were. The phenomena of mind and consciousness in people. How they evolved, how they work, and even the functional role that they play in our behavior are as utterly mysterious to us now as the forces that powered the sun were to scientists then. We don't have answers to any of these questions, and no answers are in immediate prospect for any of them. At present, we have nothing more than a few clues and a great deal of speculation. Indeed, satisfactory answers to these questions would be up there with understanding the origins and fate of the universe in terms of scientific significance. It is this fundamental lack of understanding that makes strong AI so difficult to approach. We have no idea where or how to begin. In fact, the situation is worse than this because we don't even really know what we are dealing with. I have casually thrown around terms like consciousness, mind, and self-awareness, but we don't, in truth, know what these things are. They seem like obvious concepts. We all experience them, after all, but we don't have the scientific apparatus to talk about any of them. We can't be certain, in a scientific sense, that they are even real, for all the common-sense evidence of our personal experiences. Herschel was able to approach his problem with an experiment, using well-understood, measurable physical concepts, temperature, energy, and so on. We just don't have tests like these available to study consciousness or mind. They aren't amenable to objective observation or measurement. There is no standard scientific unit of measurement for mind or subjective experience, or even any direct way of measuring them. I can't see what you are thinking or experiencing. Historically, much of our understanding of the structure and operation of the human brain was obtained by studying people whose brains had been damaged in some way, by disease or trauma. But this hardly lends itself to a systematic research program. While neuroimaging techniques, such as magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, give us important insights into the structure and operation of the brain, they don't provide access to an individual's mind. Despite the fact that we don't have any precise definitions, we can identify some common features that arise in discussions about consciousness. Probably the most important idea is that something conscious must have the ability to experience things subjectively. By subjectively, I mean from your own personal mental perspective. One important aspect of this is the sensation of internal mental phenomena, what philosophers call qualia. This is a fancy name for a simple idea. Qualia are the mental sensations that we all experience, like the smell of coffee. Pause for a moment and think about that smell, or better, go and make yourself a good cup. Inhale the aroma. That sensation you experienced was an example of qualia. The experience of drinking a cold beer on a hot day, the feeling when the weather begins to change from winter to spring, the feeling when my children succeed at something new. All of these are qualia. You may well recognize them and have enjoyed them yourself, but the paradox is that even though we believe we are talking about the same experiences, there is no way that we can know whether you experience them in the same way that I do, because qualia and other mental experiences are inherently private. The mental experience I had when I smelled the coffee was only accessible to me. I have no way of telling whether you actually had a similar experience, even if we use the same words to describe it. One of the most famous contributions to the debate on consciousness was made by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel in 1974. Nagel proposed a test by which, he suggested, you can distinguish whether something is or is not conscious. Suppose you want to know whether the following are conscious: a human being, an orangutan, a dog, a rat, an earthworm, a toaster, a rock. The test Nagel proposed was to consider whether the question, what is it like to be an X, makes sense when applied to entities like those in the list. If we believe that it is like something to be an X, where X is a human being or an orangutan, etc., then Nagel argued that the X in question is conscious. Looking at our list, the question is meaningful when applied to human beings. What about orangutans? I think so, and the same for dogs, and also, although slightly less obviously, rats. So, orangutans, dogs, and rats, according to Nagel's test, are conscious. Of course, this is not a proof that they are conscious. We are having to rely on common sense rather than objective scientific evidence. What about earthworms? Here, I think we are at the threshold of consciousness. Earthworms are such simple creatures that it seems doubtful, to me anyway, that Nagel's test makes sense in this case. So, by his argument, earthworms are not conscious. There is some scope for debate in this latter case. One might argue that even earthworms have some primitive consciousness, but then I would have to insist that it was indeed primitive compared to human consciousness. However, I'm not going to allow debate about toasters and rocks. They obviously failed the test. It isn't like anything to be a toaster. Nagel's test highlights a number of important points. First, consciousness is not an all-or-nothing thing. It is a spectrum, with fully fledged human consciousness at one extreme and earthworms at the other. But even between humans, there are differences. The extent to which a person is conscious will vary depending on whether they are under the influence of alcohol or drugs or are just plain tired. Second, consciousness is different for different entities. The title of Nagel's article was, "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel chose bats for the title of his article because they are so unlike us. Nagel's question surely makes sense when applied to bats, so bats enjoy consciousness, according to Nagel's theory. But bats have senses that we don't have, most notably a kind of sonar. They emit ultrasonic sounds as they fly and detect the echoes of these squeaks to perceive their environment. Some bats are even able to detect the Earth's magnetic field and use it for navigation. They have their own built-in magnetic compass. We don't have these senses, and for this reason, we cannot actually imagine what it is like to be a bat, even though we think Nagel's question is meaningful when applied to bats. So, bat consciousness is thus different from human consciousness. In fact, Nagel believed it is beyond our ability to comprehend, even though we may be confident it exists. Nagel's main purpose was to set out a test for consciousness. What is it like to be an X? And to argue that certain forms of consciousness must remain beyond our comprehension. We can't imagine what it would be like to be a bat. But his test can be applied to computers, and most people seem to believe that it isn't like anything to be a computer any more than a toaster. For this reason, Nagel's "what is it like" argument has been used against the possibility of strong AI. Strong AI is impossible, according to this argument, because computers cannot be conscious by Nagel's argument. I am personally not convinced by this argument because asking, "What is it like to be a," is for me nothing more than an appeal to our intuition. Our intuition works well at separating out the obvious cases, orangutans and toasters, but I don't see why we should expect it to be a reliable guide in the more subtle cases, or cases that are far outside our own experience of the natural world, such as AI. Perhaps we can't imagine what it would be like to be a computer just because they are so utterly unlike us. But that doesn't imply, to me at least, that machine consciousness is impossible, just that machine consciousness would be different. Nagel's argument is one of many that have been set out in an attempt to show strong AI to be impossible. Let's take a look at the best known of these. Is strong AI possible? Nagel's argument is closely related to a common-sense objection to the possibility of strong AI, which says that it is not possible because there is something special about people. This intuitive response starts from the view that computers are different from people because people are animate objects, but computers are not. According to this argument, I have more in common with a rat than with a computer. A computer has more in common with a toaster than with me. My response to this is that however remarkable humans are, ultimately, they are nothing more than a bunch of atoms. People and their brains are physical entities, obeying physical laws, even if we don't yet quite know what those laws are. Humans are remarkable, wonderful, incredible things, but from the point of view of the universe and its laws, we are nothing special. Of course, this doesn't answer the difficult question of how a particular bunch of atoms leads to conscious experience, a point to which we will return later. A variation of the humans are special argument was put forward by the American philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, whom we met earlier as a critic of early AI. One of Dreyfus's main points in his critique of AI was that it had rather oversold itself, considering its actual achievements, and in this respect he surely had a point. But he also had a concrete argument against the possibility of strong AI. His argument was that much of human action and decision-making is based on intuition, which he believed could not be made precise in the way that computers require. In short, Dreyfus argued, human intuition could not be reduced to a recipe like a computer program. Now, there is certainly a wealth of evidence that much of our decision-making is not based on explicit or rigorous reasoning. We frequently make decisions without being able to articulate our rationale for them. Probably most of our decision-making is of this type, in fact. In this sense, we certainly use some sort of intuition. But surely this results from experience we have gained over time, or perhaps experience learned through evolution, which has been transmitted to us through our genes, which, even if we cannot articulate it at a conscious level, is nevertheless nothing mysterious. And, as we have seen, computers can learn from experience and become effective decision-makers, even if they cannot articulate the rationale for their decisions. The most famous argument against the possibility of strong AI is due to the philosopher John Searle, who coined the terms strong and weak AI. He invented a scenario called the Chinese room in an attempt to show that strong AI is impossible. The Chinese room scenario goes like this. Imagine a man working alone in a room. Through a slot in the door, he receives cards on which questions are written in Chinese. He understands no Chinese himself. He takes these cards and then carefully follows a list of written instructions in order to write an answer in Chinese, which he then passes back out of the room. Now, the room and its contents are actually engaged in a Chinese Turing test, and the answers provided by the room convince the interrogators that the subject of the test is a human. Now, ask yourself, is there any understanding of Chinese present here? Searle argues not. The man in the room doesn't understand Chinese, and surely the room itself has no understanding of Chinese. No matter where we look here, we find no understanding of Chinese. The man is doing nothing more than carefully following a precise recipe to derive a response to the question. His human intelligence is used only to the extent that he dutifully follows the instructions he is given. Observe that the man is doing exactly what a computer does, simply following a list of instructions, a recipe. The program he is executing are the instructions he is given. So, according to Searle, by the same argument, a computer passing the Turing test will not exhibit understanding. If Searle's argument is correct, then it means that understanding, and hence strong AI, cannot be produced by following a recipe. Strong AI, therefore, can't be achieved with conventional computers. If correct, this simple argument would kill the grand dream of AI. No matter how much your program appeared to have understanding, this would be nothing more than an illusion. Behind the scenes, there would be nothing there. Many counter-arguments have been proposed to Searle's critique. An obvious common-sense response is to point out that Searle's Chinese room is simply not possible. Apart from anything else, having a human play the role of a computer processor would mean it would take millennia to carry out a single second's worth of computer program instructions, and the idea of encoding the relevant program as written instructions is absurd. A typical large-scale computer program of the present day will involve about 100 million lines of computer code. To actually write out such code in a form that a human could read would require tens of thousands of printed volumes. A computer can retrieve instructions from memory in microseconds, whereas the Chinese room computer would be billions of times slower. Given these practical facts, the Chinese room and its contents could not convince an interrogator that it was a person. It could not, in fact, pass the Turing test. Another standard response to the Chinese room is that while the person in the room does not exhibit understanding, and the room itself doesn't, the system that must be present, which contains the person, the room, the instructions, and so on, does. And indeed, if we went digging around in a human brain, looking for understanding, we would not find it. While there certainly are areas of the human brain that seem to be responsible for language understanding, we will not find within these understanding of the kind Searle asks for. I believe that there is an even simpler response to Searle's ingenious thought experiment. The Chinese room puzzle, expressed as a kind of Turing test, is a cheat because it does not treat the room as a black box. We only claim that there is no understanding in the Chinese room when we start to look inside it. The Turing test itself insisted that we should only look at the inputs and outputs and ask whether the behavior we witness is indistinguishable from that of a human. It seems to me to be pointless to get caught up in an argument about whether a computer really understands, if, in fact, it is doing something that is indistinguishable from human understanding. Another argument against the possibility of strong AI is that there is some particular feature of human brains or bodies that creates human consciousness and self-awareness, and which cannot be realized by a computer. What might such a feature be? The distinguished British physicist Roger Penrose argued that consciousness might have its origins in certain quantum phenomena, which by their very nature cannot be computed using conventional computers. The details of why certain quantum phenomena cannot be computed need not detain us here. Penrose's argument is an intriguing one, and nobody has come up with a definitive rebuttal. But equally, there doesn't seem to be any actual evidence that consciousness does indeed depend on non-computable quantum phenomena. The mainstream AI community doesn't give this argument much credence, although technically it is considered possible. Yet another possible objection is that perhaps intelligence cannot be computed by a conventional computer because of their mathematically provable limitations. Remember that we know from Turing's work that there are fundamental limits to what computers can and cannot do. There are some clearly definable problems that cannot be solved by a computer. So, what if intelligent behavior of the kind that AI strives for is not computable in the sense that Turing proposed? Turing himself discussed this as a possible argument against strong AI. Most AI researchers aren't concerned by it, but, as we have often seen earlier, the problem of what is practically computable has been a major stumbling block for AI throughout its history. Mind and body. We now turn to the most famous philosophical puzzle in the study of consciousness, the mind-body problem. Certain physical processes in the human body and brain give rise to the conscious mind. But how and why exactly do they do that? What precisely is the relationship between the physical world of neurons, synapses, and axons to our conscious subjective experience? This is one of the biggest and oldest problems in science and philosophy. The Australian philosopher David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness. The literature on the topic goes back at least as far as Plato. In the Phaedrus, he proposed a model of human behavior in which a reasoning component of the brain acts as a charioteer holding the reins of two horses, one horse representing rational, noble desires, the other representing irrational or unworthy desires. The course that a person takes through life depends on how their charioteer controls these two horses. A similar idea appears in the Hindu Upanishads. Viewing the rational self as a chariot driver is a wonderful metaphor. But, cute though it undoubtedly is, I'm rather taken with the idea of holding the reins to both the noble and unworthy parts of my mind. It suffers from a common problem in theories of the mind. Plato imagines the charioteer to be a mind, but all he's then done is say that the mind is controlled by another mind, the charioteer. Philosophers call this the homunculus problem. Homunculus means little man, the little man in this case being the charioteer. It's a problem because it doesn't actually explain anything. It just delegates the problem of mind to another representation of the mind. In any case, the chariot model is dubious because it suggests that reasoning is the main driver for our behavior, and there is a wealth of evidence that this is very much not the case. For example, in a celebrated series of experiments, the neuroscientist John Dillon Haynes was apparently able to detect decisions made by human subjects up to 10 seconds before the subjects themselves were consciously aware that they had made a decision. This result raises all sorts of questions, but one of the most important is simply, if conscious thought and reasoning is not the mechanism via which we decide what to do, then what on earth is it for? When we are presented with some feature of the human body, evolutionary theory tells us that we should ask what evolutionary advantage that feature gave us. So, in just the same way, we can ask what evolutionary advantage the conscious mind gave us, because, presumably, if it gave us no advantage, then it wouldn't have come into being. One theory is that the conscious mind is actually nothing more than a meaningless byproduct of the features in our body that actually produce our behavior. This theory goes by the rather exhausting name of epiphenomenalism. If the conscious mind is epiphenomenal, then rather than being the charioteer holding the reins, as Plato suggested, your conscious mind is instead a passenger in the chariot, under the illusion that it is the charioteer. A slightly less dramatic view is that the conscious mind does not play a primary role in our behavior in the way that Plato suggested, but rather that it somehow arises from other processes in our brain, presumably processes that are not present in lower-order animals, which, insofar as we can tell, don't enjoy as rich a mental life as we do. In what follows, we'll explore one key component of our conscious human experience, our social nature, by which I mean our ability to understand ourselves and others as part of a social group, and to be able to reason about others and about how others see us. This key capability most probably evolved as a requirement for living and working together in large, complex social groups. To understand this, we'll start by looking at a celebrated thread of work on the social brain carried out by the British evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar. The social brain. Dunbar was interested in the following simple question. Why do humans and other primates have such large brains compared with those of other animals? Ultimately, the brain is an information processing device, and one that consumes a considerable proportion of the total energy produced by a human body. About 20% is a typical estimate. So, a large brain would have evolved in order to deal with some important information processing requirement for the primate, and given its energy requirements, it would have to yield some substantial evolutionary advantage. But what information processing requirement, and what evolutionary advantage exactly? Dunbar looked at a number of primates and possible factors that might imply the need for enhanced information processing capacity. For example, one possible explanation might be the primate's need to keep track of food sources in their environment. Another possible explanation could be the requirement for primates with a larger ranging or foraging area to keep track of bigger spatial maps. However, Dunbar found that the factor that best predicted brain size was the primate's mean social group size, the average number of animals in that primate's social groups. But this, then, suggests that the large brain size of primates is needed to be able to successfully maintain large social groups. More precisely, the need to keep track of, maintain, and exploit the social relationships in these groups. Dunbar's research raised a tantalizing question. Given that we know the average human brain size, what does his analysis predict as being the average group size for humans? The value obtained by this analysis is now known as Dunbar's number, and it is usually quoted as 150. That is, given the average human brain size and Dunbar's analysis of other primates, we would expect the average size of human social groups to be around 150. Dunbar's number might have remained a curiosity, but for the fact that subsequent research found that this number has arisen repeatedly across the planet in terms of actual human social group sizes. For example, it seems that Neolithic farming villages typically contained around 150 inhabitants. Of more recent interest is the fact that Dunbar's number has something to say about the number of friends we actively engage with on social networking sites such as Facebook. Dunbar's number can be interpreted as being roughly the number of human relationships that a human brain can manage. Of course, most of us nowadays interact with much larger groups than this, but Dunbar's number is the number of relationships that we can truly keep track of. In short, if this analysis is correct, then the human brain is different because it is a social brain. It is large compared to that of other primates because we live in large social groups, and this requires the ability to keep track of and manage a large number of social relationships. The natural next question is what it means exactly to keep track of and manage these social relationships. To answer this, we will explore an idea due to the celebrated American philosopher Daniel Dennett, the idea that we understand and predict people's behavior using what he called the intentional stance. The intentional stance. As we look around our world and try to make sense of what we see, it seems that we naturally make a distinction between agents and other objects. We have already heard the term agent used in this book. It was the idea of an AI program independently acting on our behalf, rationally pursuing our preferences. An agent in the sense that we are now discussing is something that seems to have a similar status to us as a self-determining actor. When a child deliberates over which chocolate to choose from a selection and carefully picks one, we perceive agency. There is choice and deliberate, purposeful, autonomous action. In contrast, when a plant grows from underneath a rock and over time pushes the rock to one side, we see no agency. There is action of a kind, but we perceive neither deliberation nor conscious purpose in the action. So, why do we interpret the actions of the child to be those of an agent, but the actions of a plant growing to be a mindless process? To understand the answer to this question, think about the various different kinds of explanation that are available to us when we try to explain the processes changing our world. One possibility is to understand the behavior of an entity with reference to what Dennett calls the physical stance. With the physical stance, we use the laws of nature, physics, chemistry, etc., to predict how a system will behave. For example, Dennett suggests that when he releases a stone he has been holding in his hand, he uses some simple physics. The stone has weight, it is acted upon by the force of gravity, to predict successfully that the stone will fall to the ground. Now, while the physical stance works well in cases such as this, it is of course not practicable for understanding or predicting the behavior of people who are far too complex to be understood in this way. It might be possible in principle, we are ultimately just a bunch of atoms, but of course isn't remotely feasible in practice. Nor, for that matter, is it a very practicable way of understanding the behavior of computers or computer programs. The source code for a typical modern computer operating system will run to hundreds of millions of lines. Another possibility is the design stance, in which we predict behavior based on our understanding of the purpose that a system is supposed to fulfill, what it was designed for. Dennett gives the example of an alarm clock. When someone presents us with an alarm clock, we do not need to make use of physical laws in order to understand its behavior. If we know it to be a clock, then we can interpret the numbers it displays as the time, because clocks are designed to display the time. Likewise, if the clock makes a loud and irritating noise, we can interpret this as an alarm that was set at a specific time, because making loud and irritating noises at specified times, but not otherwise, is again something that alarm clocks are designed to do. No understanding of the clock's internal mechanism is required for such an interpretation. It is justified by the fact that alarm clocks are designed to exhibit such behavior. A third possibility, and the one that interests us here, is the one that Dennett calls the intentional stance. From this perspective, we attribute mental states to entities, mental states such as beliefs and desires, and then use a common-sense theory of these mental states to predict how the entity will behave, under the assumption that it makes choices in accordance with its attributed beliefs and desires. The most obvious rationale for this approach is that when explaining human activity, it is often useful to make statements such as the following. Janine believes it is going to rain and wants to stay dry. Peter wants to finish his marking. If Janine believes it is going to rain and wants to stay dry, then we might predict that she will wear a raincoat or take an umbrella or avoid going outside altogether, for these are the kinds of behaviors that we expect of a rational agent who has these beliefs and desires. Thus, the intentional stance has both explanatory and predictive power. It allows us to explain what people did and what they will be likely to do. Note that as with the design stance, the intentional stance is neutral about the internal mechanism that is actually producing the behavior. The theory works equally well for machines as for people, as we will discuss in more detail later. Dennett coined the term intentional system to describe entities whose behavior can be most usefully understood and predicted by the method of attributing to them beliefs, desires, and rational choice. There is a natural hierarchy of increasingly sophisticated intentional systems. A first-order intentional system has beliefs and desires of its own, but it doesn't have any beliefs and desires about beliefs and desires. In contrast, a second-order intentional system is capable of having beliefs and desires about beliefs and desires. The following statements illustrate this. First order. Janine believed it was raining. Second order. Michael wanted Janine to believe it was raining. Third order. Peter believed Michael wanted Janine to believe it was raining. In our everyday lives, it seems we probably do not use more than about 3 layers of the intentional stance hierarchy. Unless we are engaged in an artificial intellectual activity, such as solving a puzzle, and it seems that most of us struggle to go beyond fifth-order reasoning. Our use of the intentional stance is intimately bound to our status as social animals. The role of such intentional ascriptions seems to be to enable us to understand and predict the behavior of other agents in society. In navigating our way through our complex social world, we become involved in higher-order intentional thinking, whereby the plans of individuals, whether ourselves or those we observe, are influenced by the anticipated intentional behavior of other agents. The value of such thinking is clear from its ubiquity in human life and the extent to which we take it for granted in our communications. Recall the 6-word conversation between Alice and Bob that we heard in Chapter 1. Bob, I'm leaving you. Alice, who is she? The obvious intentional stance explanation of this scenario is simple, uncontrived, and compelling. Alice believes that Bob prefers someone else to her and that he is planning accordingly. Alice also wants to know who this is, perhaps in the hope of dissuading him, and she believes that asking Bob will induce him to tell her. It is difficult to explain the exchange without appealing to concepts like belief and desire, not only as playing a role in Alice's and Bob's behavior, but also featuring explicitly in their thinking and planning. Dunbar looked at the relationship between brain size and the capacity for higher-order intentional reasoning capabilities in humans and other animals. It turns out that the capability for higher-order intentional reasoning is, approximately speaking, a linear function of the relative size of the frontal lobe of the brain. Since brain size correlates strongly with social group size, it follows that a natural evolutionary explanation for large brains is precisely the need for and value of social reasoning, higher-order intentional reasoning, within a complex society. Whether hunting in groups, battling with conflicting tribes, pursuing a mate, perhaps against rivals, or gaining allies for influence and leadership, the value of being able to understand and anticipate the thinking of other individuals is self-evident. Returning to Dunbar's arguments, larger social groups will make more demands for higher-order social reasoning, thereby explaining the relationship between brain size and social group size that Dunbar identified. Going back to our original motivation, levels of intentionality appear to correlate with degrees of consciousness. As we already discussed, the class of things we would admit as first-order intentional systems is very broad indeed. But higher-order intentionality is a much higher bar. We are higher-order intentional systems, but I would not accept anybody trying to persuade me that, for example, an earthworm was. What about a dog? You might just about be able to persuade me that a dog was capable of having beliefs about my desires. It believes I want it to sit, for example. But if a dog is capable of higher-order intentional reasoning, then it is likely to be at most a rather limited and specialized capability. There are indications that some other primates have a limited capacity for higher-order intentional reasoning. For example, vervet monkeys make use of a warning cry to indicate the presence of leopards to other monkeys, a threat to the monkey community. They have been observed to use the warning cry to trick other vervet monkeys into believing that they are under attack by leopards. A natural explanation of this trick seems to involve higher-order intentional reasoning. If I make the warning cry, then they will believe leopards are attacking and want to get away. One can, of course, put forward alternative explanations which do not imply higher-order intentional reasoning. Nevertheless, the anecdote gives credence to the claim that some non-human animals do engage in higher-order intentional reasoning. Social reasoning in the form of higher-order intentionality seems to be correlated with consciousness, and social reasoning evolved to support complex social networks and large social groups. But why might social reasoning require consciousness in the form of there being something it is like to be an agent? My colleague, Peter Millikan, has suggested that the answer may lie precisely in the computational efficiency of the intentional stance. If I have conscious access to my own functional motivators, in the form of desires, beliefs, and so on, and can also think myself into the subjective situation of other people, then this enables me to predict their behavior in both actual and imagined circumstances far more efficiently than I could otherwise. By imagining myself in your position, if I were to steal your food, for example, I can instinctively feel, without calculation, the sort of anger you would then feel, can anticipate the reprisals you might plan, and will thus be motivated to resist my temptation to steal from you. This is an interesting speculation, but whatever the relationship may be between human social reasoning ability and consciousness, we aren't likely to get definitive answers anytime soon. So, let's now return to our main purpose, AI, and consider the possibility of machines that are capable of social reasoning. Can machines believe and desire? The intentional stance plays an important role in human society, but it can also be applied to a wide range of other entities. For example, consider a conventional light switch. The intentional stance provides a perfectly serviceable descriptive explanation for the behavior of a light switch. The switch transmits current when it believes we want it transmitted, and not otherwise. We communicate our desires by flicking the switch. However, the intentional stance is surely not the most appropriate way of understanding and predicting the behavior of a light switch. Here it is far simpler to adopt the physical stance or the design stance. By contrast, an intentional stance explanation of the switch's behavior requires attributing to it beliefs about the flowing or absence of current and also beliefs about our own desires. Although this intentional account provides an accurate prediction of the switch's behavior, it seems rather extravagant as an explanation. With respect to the intentional stance applied to machines, there seem to be two main questions. When is it legitimate to use the intentional stance to talk about machines, and when is it useful to do so? John McCarthy, who was an influential thinker on the subject of machines with mental states, had this to say on these questions. To ascribe certain beliefs, knowledge, free will, intentions, consciousness, abilities, or wants to a machine or computer program is legitimate when such an ascription expresses the same information about the machine that it expresses about a person. Ascription of mental qualities is most straightforward for machines of known structure, such as thermostats and computer operating systems, but is most useful when applied to entities whose structure is very incompletely known. This is a rather dense quote, so let's try to unpack it a little bit. First, McCarthy suggests an intentional stance explanation of a machine should express the same information about the machine that it expresses about a person. This is quite a big requirement, of course, reminiscent of the indistinguishability requirement for the Turing test. Adapting an example we saw earlier, if we claim a robot believes it is raining and that the robot wants to stay dry, then this would be a meaningful ascription if the robot behaved as a rational agent with these beliefs and desires would behave. So, if the robot was able to, then it should take appropriate action to prevent getting wet. If the robot didn't take such action, then we would be inclined to say that either it didn't believe it was raining, or it didn't really want to stay dry, or that it was not rational. Finally, McCarthy points out that the intentional stance is of greatest value when we don't understand the structure or operation of an entity. It provides a method for explaining and predicting behavior independently of its internal structure and operation, for example, whether it is a person or a dog or a robot. If you are a rational agent with the desire to stay dry and the belief that it is raining, then I can explain and predict your behavior without knowing anything else about you. Toward conscious machines. What does all this tell us with respect to our dreams for AI? Let me conclude by rashly making some concrete proposals for what progress toward conscious machines might look like and how we might create it. I look forward to rereading this section in my dotage to see how my predictions turn out. Let's go back to DeepMind's celebrated Atari playing system. Recall that DeepMind built an agent that learned to play a large number of Atari video games. These games were in many ways relatively simple, and of course, DeepMind has subsequently progressed beyond these to much more complex games such as StarCraft II. At present, the main concerns in experiments like this are to be able to handle games with very large branching factors, games in which there is imperfect information about the state of the game and the actions of other players, games where the rewards available in the game are distant from the actions that lead to those rewards, and games where the actions an agent must perform are not simple binary decisions, such as in Breakout, but ones which involve long and complex sequences, possibly coordinated with or in competition with the actions of others. This is fascinating work, and the progress that's been made here is very impressive. But it is hard to see a simple progression of this work leading to conscious machines, because the issues being addressed don't seem to be those that are relevant for consciousness. This is not a criticism of this work, of course. These are just not the issues that this work aims to address. Given our previous discussion, let me therefore make some tentative suggestions about how we might progress toward this goal. Suppose we have a machine learning program that learns on its own, just as the DeepMind agent did in Breakout, to succeed in a scenario that requires meaningful, complex, higher-order intentional reasoning. Or a scenario that requires an agent to tell a sophisticated lie, which implies higher-order intentional reasoning. Or a scenario in which an agent learns to communicate and meaningfully express properties of its own mental state and those of others. A system that could learn to do these things in a meaningful way would, I think, be some significant way along the road to conscious machines. The key word here is meaningful. Whenever one suggests a test like this, somebody will try to find some way of gaming the test, so that they can claim to have succeeded even if they do so in a way that you didn't anticipate. This is, of course, precisely what happened with the Turing test. What I'm after is programs that can do this in a substantive way, not programs that pass the test through a combination of smoke and mirrors. What I have in mind here is something like the Sally-Ann test, which has been proposed to assist in the diagnosis of autism in children. Autism is a serious, widespread psychiatric condition that manifests itself in childhood. The key symptoms of autism are that social and communication development are clearly abnormal in the first few years of life, and the child's play is characterized by a lack of the usual flexibility, imagination, and pretense. The key features of the social abnormalities in autism include lack of eye contact, lack of normal social awareness or appropriate social behavior, aloneness, one-sidedness in interaction, and inability to join a social group. A typical Sally-Ann test consists of a short story that is told or enacted to the child being tested, such as this one. Sally and Anne are in a room which contains a basket, a box, and a marble. Sally puts the marble into the basket and then leaves the room. While Sally is out of the room, Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box. Then Sally comes back into the room and wants to play with the marble. The child being tested is then asked a question. Where will Sally look for the marble? The appropriate answer to this question is in the basket. But to get to this answer, the subject would need to be able to do some reasoning about the beliefs of others. Sally did not see Anne move the marble, so Sally will believe that the marble is where she left it, in the basket. Autistic children, it seems, overwhelmingly answer the question incorrectly, while neurotypical children almost always answer correctly. Simon Baron-Cohen and his co-authors, who pioneered this approach, take this as evidence that autistic children lack what has become known as a theory of mind, TOM. The TOM is the practical, common-sense capability that fully developed adults have to be able to reason about the mental states, beliefs, desires, and so on of others and themselves. Humans are not born with a TOM, but neurotypical humans are born with the capability to develop one. Clinically normal children develop their theory of mind progressively. By the age of 4, children are able to reason, including others' perspectives and viewpoints, and their TOM is fully developed in their teens. At the time of writing, there is beginning to be some research into how machine learning programs can learn a primitive TOM. Research has recently developed a neural net system called TOM-Net, Theory of Mind Net, which is able to learn how to model other agents and behave correctly in situations resembling Sally-Ann puzzles. However, the work is at a very early stage, and the ability to solve a Sally-Ann puzzle is not enough to claim artificial consciousness. But this is, I think, a step in the right direction. It gives us another goal to aim toward, an AI system that autonomously learns a human-level TOM. Would it be like us? When discussing AI and people, we talk about the brain a lot, and this is quite natural. The brain is the main information processing component of the human body, which does the heavy lifting when we carry out tasks such as solving problems, understanding stories, and so on. So, we naturally tend to imagine that the brain is like the computer controlling a driverless car, receiving and interpreting sensory information from our eyes and ears and other senses, and telling our hands, arms, and legs what to do. But that is a grossly oversimplified model of the true state of affairs, because the brain is one component of a tightly integrated system containing multiple complex components which evolved together as a single organism over the billions of years since life first appeared on our planet. We are, in evolutionary terms, nothing more than apes, apes with a sense of entitlement. and human consciousness has to be understood against this background. Our current capabilities, including the conscious mind, are the result of evolutionary forces that drove the development of our ancestors. Just as our hands and eyes and ears evolved, so did human consciousness. Fully fledged human consciousness did not emerge overnight. There was no sudden light switch moment before which our ancestors were like earthworms and after which they were like Shakespeare. Our ancient ancestors did not enjoy the full range of conscious experience that we did, and we are most likely not to be enjoying the same range of conscious experiences that our descendants in the deep future will. The process of evolutionary development is surely not finished yet. Intriguingly, the historical record can give us some clues about how and why certain elements of consciousness emerged. The historical record is sparse, so we are inevitably forced to speculate a lot, but nevertheless, the clues are tantalizing. Every currently existing species of ape, including Homo sapiens, us, had a common ancestor until about 18 million years ago. Around that time, the evolutionary family tree of the apes began to fork, sending orangutans on a different evolutionary path about 16 million years ago and separating us from gorillas and chimpanzees between 6 and 7 million years ago. After this split, our ancestors began to adopt a characteristic that distinguished us from other ape species. We began to spend more time on the ground rather than in trees, ultimately walking upright on 2 feet. One possible explanation for this transformation is that it was necessitated by climatic changes, which reduced forest cover, forcing our tree-dwelling ancestors out into open land. Leaving tree cover probably increased the risk of attack by predators, and a natural evolutionary response was to increase the size of social groups, since larger social groups are less susceptible to predator attack. And larger social groups demanded the social reasoning skills we discussed earlier, and larger brains to support these social reasoning skills. Although our ancestors used fire sporadically as far back in time as 1 million years ago, it seems that it became commonly used somewhere approximately 500,000 years ago. Fire gave a whole range of benefits to our ancestors. It gave light and warmth, frightened away potential predators, and increased the opportunities for feeding. However, fires require care and maintenance, so this new technology required the ability to cooperate in order to take turns minding the fire, collecting fuel, and so on. Cooperation of this kind would have benefited from the ability to undertake higher-order intentional reasoning in order to understand each other's desires and intentions, and possibly language, which seems to have evolved at about the same time. Once the capability for language was established, further benefits from its development would have become apparent. We can't reconstruct with any certainty the precise sequence of developments and the new capabilities they would have brought with them, but the broad sweep seems clear, and I think we can make out some components of consciousness appearing over time. Of course, this doesn't answer the hard problem of consciousness, but at least it gives us some plausible clues about how and why some of the necessary components for fully fledged human consciousness appeared. Ultimately, they might turn out to be dead ends, but conjecture usually leads toward a more solid understanding, eventually. And they offer more than simply treating consciousness as an unknowable mystery. At some point in the future, we will understand consciousness, just as we now understand the forces that power the sun. At that point in time, much of the current debate on the subject will probably seem as quaintly amusing as the various theories put forward to explain the source of the sun's power did before nuclear physics provided the answers. Suppose we succeed in my research agenda of building machines with a human-level theory of mind, machines that autonomously learn to handle complex higher-order intentional reasoning, that can build and maintain complex social relationships, that can express complex properties of their own mental state and those of others. Would these machines really have a mind, consciousness, self-awareness? The problem is, from this distance, we just can't answer this question. We'll have a much better idea as we get closer to being able to build such machines. If, that is, we are ever able to build them. It may conceivably be that we are never able to answer this question satisfactorily, although I can see no reason why this should be the case. But at this point, the ghost of Alan Turing is trying to get my attention. Because Turing, you may recall, argued that if the machine is doing something that is really indistinguishable from the real thing, then we should stop arguing about whether it is really conscious or self-aware. If it is truly indistinguishable by any reasonable test that we can invent, then that may be as much as we can ever ask. We hope you've enjoyed this production of A Brief History of Artificial Intelligence, a Macmillan audio production for Flatiron Books. This title was produced by Joshan Chana at the Audiobook Producers. Executive producer for Macmillan Audio, Guy Oldfield. Post-production by Ben Firth at the Audiobook Producers. Text copyright 2020 by Michael Wooldridge. Production copyright 2021 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.